I would say that every human being can be their own Moses. So I think I would say that every human being is responsible to activate the inner ethical self in such a way that they can make the world a better place. There's a beautiful concept in Judaism. It's not exclusive to Judaism, but it's also Judaism. This universal principle of tikkun olam, making the world a better place. And I think we are responsible to activate our own gifts. And yes, every single person should be reading ethically, should be thinking ethically, should be thinking about their own actions and critically evaluating the assumptions they're making when they enter into the university, into the workplace, into the space of education and thinking.
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. Today's guest is Hindy Najman. It was truly an honor to be able to sit down and talk to her. Like I said last week, if you heard that episode, setting up the preview for this interview, she was one of the first people that Sophia Johnson, the first guest on this podcast, brought up. And then I kept running into her name. I got to, at Heather McCumber's suggestion, I got to see her talk about the book that we discuss in this interview, Seconding Sinai, at SBL. And I get to see her interact with students from the past and the present. And she is a wonderful mentor and a lovely person. And this conversation was very touching and affecting. And I didn't realize that until I sat down to edit it. I'll stop going on and gushing about her and what a pleasure it was to talk to her. I hope that comes out in the interview. If you want to tell me how wonderful you thought this conversation was, or what I need to fix, or who I should have on that I haven't, reach out to me at itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. Also, if you want to provide any financial support for $5 a month, you can hear episodes early over on Patreon. I'll make sure there's a link to that in the show notes. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Hindy Najman. Hindy Najman, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's so great to be here.
Before we get going, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I am a professor of Hebrew Bible Old Testament at the University of Oxford. I've been there for almost a decade. And in that time, I built a center for the study of the Bible, and I've grown a large community of undergraduates and postgraduate students, what in America we would call graduate students, who are thinking about the place of the Hebrew Bible in the humanities writ large.
Okay, that's a pretty good summary. Today, we'll be discussing you already know this, but the listeners don't. So we'll be discussing your book, Seconding Sinai, The Development of Mosaic Discourse in Second Temple Judaism, which I had the good fortune of seeing a panel devoted to that, in honor of its 20th anniversary in November at SBL. I did not know at the time there was like a follow-up or a Seconding Sinai coming out. And you're saying that's forthcoming from OUP. I'll absolutely jump on getting on that. But to begin with, so the Mosaic Discourse that you talk, can you explain what is the Mosaic Discourse that you're talking about in this book?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for asking, Jared. It's such a wonderful opportunity to talk to you about this. So, the most important thing for me in that book was a corrective to scholarship. Instead of thinking about what Moses actually wrote or didn't write, or what Jeremiah did or didn't write, I focused my first monograph on how to understand the claim that the figure of Moses authored materials during his own lifetime or long after his death and in subsequent centuries, trying to understand what scholars had called a forgery or operated with a hermeneutics of suspicion, and instead to try to understand in a generous way what it means to say that something is associated with a figure who might not be alive anymore, or things that he couldn't have known or couldn't have said. And what I came to understand was that there was a whole lot of stuff in the history of ancient Judaism and early Christianity that came to understand Moses as the figure who generated new interpretations, new readings, new texts, new thinking. And then I also found out that Mosaic discourse can also be called Virgilian discourse or Homeric discourse or Shakespearean discourse, by which I mean throughout the history of humankind and civilization, a figure who's a transformative figure, either mythical or actual, real or imagined, becomes a holding pattern for the growth and transformation of what I would call an interpretive community.
There's a lot there. So in this conversation, we get into pseudepigrapha,
Sure.
and so just laying the foundation. So now you've introduced us to Mosaic discourse. How does that introduce us to pseudepigrapha and the question of legitimacy?
That's such a great question. I'm going to try to answer it in three different ways, if that's okay, because it's such a rich question. First, I want to say that the category pseudepigrapha, false writing, pseudo, false, epigraphy, grapho, writing, false writing, is a category of texts that have typically been understood to be not as authentic or not mapping on to the author who's said to have written them. So it's not really a very helpful category. It's a scholarly category, which really comes out of theological presupposition. What is and isn't authentic? Did Isaiah write all of Isaiah? No, but we don't call that pseudepigrapha. Did Daniel write all of Daniel? No, but it actually came to be a category of texts that are somehow not Hebrew Bible or Old Testament and not New Testament, but other texts that are associated with other figures. But then there are other things like pseudo-Pauline epistles, or texts that are said to be written by Paul, written by Jeremiah, but aren't. It's a very murky category, which if I had my druthers, I would take it and throw it out the window. And I would say, can we please try to understand what the texts are doing? And this leads me to my second way of answering the question. So the one is I want to problematize pseudepigrapha. The second thing I want to say is, wait a minute. Pseudepigrapha, and this is an article that I wrote with a colleague of mine who's a classicist, a professor at Harvard named Rene Perano. And we wrote an article together called Pseudepigraphy as an interpretive construct. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is by associating text with Moses, our ancient writers, scribes, thinkers, rabbis, church fathers associated certain traditions that are inherited and developed. And I'm going to use the example of Moses, associated with Moses, but not that Moses wrote them, but it's faithful to the tradition of Moses. So interpretive principles are said to be Mosaic. Certain teachings are said to be Mosaic. Certain practices, rituals are said to be Mosaic, quite apart from the book of Deuteronomy. How did Deuteronomy come to be associated with Moses when Moses' own death is described? The rabbis have answers to that, but it's a complicated question how Moses could have been associated with materials and ongoing materials that are associated with him as a figure, like the book of Jubilees, for example. But the figure of Moses, and this is the third way of answering the question, what is Moses? Who is Moses? Moses continues to change over time as the traditions of Judaism are vibrant and vital and grow in their association with Moses. And this is also, by the way, true of Christianity, because of course Moses is also a very seminal figure. For example, the Sermon on the Mount. So Sinai, as well as the figure of Moses, as well as the Torah of Moses, this is my third way of answering this question. So pseudepigrapha is a way of actually, I would prefer to call it great figures in the history of the ancient Jewish and Christian tradition. So whether it's Jesus or it's Moses, or it's Peter, or it's Jeremiah, or it's Isaiah, or it's Esther, traditions linked with particular figures grow over time. For me, it's not about authentic or inauthentic, original authors versus later pseudo authors. It's actually about the way in which traditions grow in the hands of authors and they look back to authorize, but at the same time, the figure of Moses will transform in the hands of the later traders. And this is a fascinating fact. If I could give you one example, the Philo of Alexandria, this Jew who wrote in the late Hellenistic period in Alexandria, he becomes one of the most important figures for Clement and Origen, who used the material and transform it in early Christianity. And he transforms the figure of Moses. Moses is like Solon and like Kyrgyz, even better. He's the best lawgiver in the world. He looks like a philosopher king. He himself becomes, when he dies, mind alone, monos nous, mind alone. And the one other person who becomes mind alone is Socrates. right? So he becomes this great Socrates. So he becomes a figure who is authoritative and authentic for the Jewish community in Alexandria and Rome, a great figure full of law, exemplifying law, living in accordance with nature. But he also is that same Moses that we encountered in Exodus through Deuteronomy.
So I think, and look, you can chastise me if you'd like, because I may be going in the wrong direction here. So to grab a hold of the word authenticity, though, is there a place where authenticity needs to be emphasized? If not necessarily in the text itself, is it the authentic community, and then there are criteria for that community to become authentic, predicated on some authority that may be the text or maybe just the tradition associated with the text? And if that question doesn't make sense, I'll ask a better one.
So it's a really incisive question, and it's a very important question to me. You've picked up on part of what I'm pushing against. One of the central pieces I'm pushing hard against is this idea that if you can get to the original moment of a text or a textual tradition, or the very words that God spoke to Isaiah or Moses or Jeremiah, that somehow, if you get to that early moment, you've redeemed the text. Because underlying that is a claim that if you get to scripture alone or the earliest level of scripture, the later levels are later or less important or even less significant because they're farther away from that original moment, right? To get at the original moment. And I would say, like you just said in your question, the original moment, there are many original moments. It's the breathing in to tradition, articulation, rearticulation, rendering traditions vital and vibrant to each community over time. And I borrowed this phrase from Alistair McIntyre in one of my very first articles, talking about what it means to create community. I think communities are created and recreated as they grow. So, what is it to be authentic in my mind is to have a community that reads or rereads a tradition in a way that speaks to the community, transforms the tradition, and brings it to life again. Now, you could say, Hindy, that's a very dangerous position. What about a triumphalist position or a replacement theology or supersessionism? Aren't these the very things that happen to the text you're talking about, which take it away from an original or an authentic moment? And I would say this is where my concept, which was the title of my inaugural address at Oxford, ethical reading, the transformation of the text and the self. So as we chart vital and revitalizing patterns of reading and interpretation, we also have to think ethically about what we're doing and how we're doing it. And this is incumbent on every generation in each community as individuals and as members of participating communities. And sometimes this requires acts of civil disobedience and stepping outside. So this is not an easy corrective, and there's not a quick fix, and there are dangers about vitality. In fact, I just presented my new book, which is called Scriptural Vitality, and two wonderful colleagues said to me, Hindy, are there dangers with this vitality that you're celebrating? Because Mosaic discourse is about the vitalization and revitalization of traditions of Moses, of Torah, of law, of wisdom, of liturgy, of observing nature through meditation and reflection.
I so I think, and these may be scholars whose work you're not familiar with, but around the same time I was reading your book, I was reading John Depew and Douglas Campbell's book, and I see that they merge together, whether they're doing so intentionally or not. Because if you were to read the New Testament as another example of Second Temple Judaism reappropriating or re-understanding the Mosaic tradition, as opposed to commandeering it, or now this is the only possibility that it could have had, I think you're less likely to find a supersessionist interpretation. And there are people, Campbell, Depew, Mark Nanos, who I think are trying to look at the New Testament. And I don't want to, I'm not trying to silo the conversation into the New Testament, but reading your book and becoming aware of, oh, this was a thing that was happening in Second Temple Judaism, it does help to make sense, at least in part, of what maybe the New Testament experiment was attempting to do. And again, I may just be rambling. I'm sorry if
Oh,
that's
no,
how
no,
this
you're
comes
not rambling
across.
at all. It's very informed and very current in scholarship. Um, if I could be permitted to answer your question in a few different directions. One is I've had enormous uptake of this book in circles of New Testament scholars, very senior and also students. There isn't a year that I haven't had a student reach out to me who didn't write a dissertation or an essay connected to Seconding Sinai in New Testament scholarship. And this has been very rewarding and exciting to me. I think that what's exciting about it, and this is just a sidebar, and then I'll come back to the main point. When you write a book, you think you know who you're writing for. I thought I was writing for my field to make corrections around pseudepigrapha or to really open up the collection that we call the Hebrew Bible or Tanakh or the Old Testament and show how it's growing within and outside of the Bible as a corrective to neo-documentarian readings, certain kind of source critical readings, to which I was very critical because I thought it deadened the work. I was also criticizing this category of late Judaism, which is Second Temple Judaism, a way of referring to it as dying or ending and making way for later religious traditions like early Christianity. And I wanted to connect the parts and show that Second Temple Judaism is very much a part of the history of Judaism, but it's also the part of history of Christianity. Philo of Alexandria is a great example, that figure I just mentioned a few minutes ago. So it's really exciting to hear you connect up with New Testament texts, which of course is also early Christianity, but it's also part and parcel of an emerging Judaism. And that conversation couldn't be more important now, right? To understand what vitality is and what the authentic is. What is history and what is interpretation? And what does it mean to talk about a vital and vibrant tradition, which thinks about its own responsibility to itself and to its community and to its impact on the world?
Shifting directions, because this was an idea that I wanted to discuss with you. Years ago, I read Diarmid McCulloch's The Reformation of History. And while I was reading your book, I was listening to that audio book while I was walking the dogs or whatever. And I came across this idea that I had forgotten about, which is essentially, actually, hold on, I have the quote here in my notes. He says, "For centuries, the general instinct in most branches of learning was that the world and humanity were in decay. Present day people knew less than people in the past, and that true wisdom lay in what had been known a long time, So is there any overlap with that idea that he was saying emerges during the
First of all,
Reformation?
I know him well. He's a wonderful man and a wonderful colleague. He of course taught in Oxford. Yeah, and wonderful, wonderful colleague, wonderful scholar. So yes and no. So there is this concept, and you hear this in Judaism as well, Yeridat Hadorot, which literally means the going down of generations. So the farther away you get from like moments of revelation, like the more corrupt or the less vibrant or the less exciting it is, and you have to defer to a past. So everything about my work, on the one hand, we stand on the shoulders of giants, but I believe in progress. I believe that the humanities and the social sciences have grown our world. And I believe that we as the human race can overcome challenges of the past and in the present to a new future, an even brighter future. Absolutely. I think that the inheritance and transformation of earlier forms of Judaism continue to get better and interesting. Wrong turns can be made, but that fundamentally, through interpretation, through social action, through caring for the poor and the widow and the orphan, these are part of the central tenets of Judaism. We can make the world a better place. And part of that is also rejecting the sense that we can never live like our predecessors lived. I think that there's a lot of progress and a lot of hope. I even embrace chat. I think that this is about a new future and new hope and progress towards newly not yet understood readings and understandings and growth of our tradition. I agree completely that I'm trying to challenge that sense of trying to get at something that was lost, or all we can do is be pale imitations of previous figures or previous moments.
But there is a tension, though, between the idea that an appeal to a Mosaic or Pauline or Socratic or Aristotelian or whatever founding fathers of America tradition and the idea that history is advancing toward progress. There is it because the critical reading seems to come more from the idea that, like, we're going to keep getting better. Let's look back at these people. Oh, look at this fraud we call pseudepigrapha. And it seems to be a tension between those ideas, no?
No, not at all. So what I would say is there's no tension at all. What I do is this is why I use that phrase, standing on the shoulders of giants. I believe that we can learn from antiquity, classical antiquity, Jewish antiquity, Christian antiquity, Chinese antiquity. I think we should, and we are responsible to our humanity by reflecting on a past and learning from it, and also creating new contexts of thinking about our current future, our present future, which is imminent. And we have the responsibility to learn from the giants of our past and ourselves to become giants as we create a new, yet undiscovered. And this is a very Emersonian narrative, very inspired by Stanley Cavell, who's one of my heroes, a great philosopher who taught at Harvard and elsewhere. He's no longer with us, but this newly unapproachable America, which Emerson understood that. Emerson understood what it was to talk about a kind of perfection which was already, but also not yet.
America may be a good example of this, though, because there is a tension between tradition and advancement in America, and there's an idealism built into bridging those two, which I will push back on. I think there is a tension between the 19th, 20th century approach to a lot of ancient thinking and that ancient thinking. And I think there was a corrective needed. And that's part of what your book is, a corrective in saying, whoa, the issue may not be whether or not Moses authored or dictated or in any sense had any influence directly as an individual on the generation of Deuteronomy or any other text, because we can look to this community developing a discourse with a tradition that they inherited.
Yeah. So for me, it's not a tension. Nietzsche was worried about the idealization of Homer or the classical tradition, and also German nationalism, which he was worried about long before the dangers of Nazi Germany took hold. He was worried about the larger implications for identification with the past and the triumphalist and dangerous appropriation of the ancients, of the classics. I think what we need is what I called the in between for me. And I hope this addresses your concern. And I really appreciate what you're worried about is ethical reading, not in a normative way, not to tell you what to think or how to think, but in a descriptive way to constantly internalize the very critical ways in which we read texts and we read politics and we read our current situation now in America. But we do that with a kind of critical and an ethical compass which enables us to reflect on humanity, on race, on religion, on gender in a way that is responsible, reflective, and open to conversation. To me, that openness allows us to bridge the gap between the tension that you so correctly have identified.
So, that ethical reading, how much is an individual capable of reading ethically, in your opinion?
I would say that every human being can be their own Moses. So I think I would say that every human being is responsible to activate the inner ethical self in such a way that they can make the world a better place. There's a beautiful concept in Judaism. It's not exclusive to Judaism, but it's also Judaism. This universal principle of tikkun olam, making the world a better place. And I think we are responsible to activate our own gifts and yes, every single person should be reading ethically, should be thinking ethically, should be thinking about their own actions and critically evaluating the assumptions they're making when they enter into the university, into the workplace, into the space of education and thinking.
But I think, and it's not implicit because you said it in there. If you're talking about Jewish identity, you are talking about something that is almost explicitly understood as inherited, as opposed to maybe a more commercial type of thinking where you as an individual, you make this decision to think a certain way, as opposed to identifying the tradition or community that you may be a part of.
When I talked about tikkun olam, and I deliberately chose that concept about correction, the correction or the refinement of the world or in the world, it's a responsibility for the world, for human beings to take responsibility for the world around them It, of course, can be a charge for an individual Jewish person, but I understand this to be incumbent on every single human being. On the one hand, Judaism is something that you can enter into by choice. It's also something that's inherited. But that responsibility is an enormous responsibility to make the world a better place, not to make people around you Jewish necessarily, but to help people understand what Judaism can bring to the world, but also who we as individuals can bring to the world with gifts, be they philosophical, be they engineering, architects, poets, doctors, lawyers. I see this very much as a universal calling to help create bridges across communities and across faiths without, and I don't just mean dialogue, I mean listening more than talking, to help us understand and really hear what it is to participate in the world as thinkers, as teachers, and as listeners.
This brings to mind, I think it was 2005. In 2005, when John Paul II died, I remember hearing George Will say he allowed people, and I think he meant particularly Catholics, to feel like they weren't just cosmic dust. And that, having been an evangelical for all of my life up to that point, didn't make sense. And the more that I've been in dialogue with people from like different Jewish traditions, I've seen a similar ability to not feel like cosmic dust, that they are grounded in something, as opposed to you as an individual were given this call and you came down to the altar and you prayed a prayer, and it is very much it's consumeristic, which is why I said like commercial. It is an idea that leaves you isolated a little bit. And I think when engaging with biblical texts, a lot of people from my background who share my background may not know that you're never reading the Bible alone. You're never reading a biblical text alone. And that's where I think my brain was going, is reading ethically requires, I think, a certain amount of gratitude for, even if you're reading a translation, the people who worked on that translation are in the room with you.
Right. So let's turn to translation in a moment, but I want to go back to two other things you've said. One is the cosmic dust. Judaism also has this notion of cosmic dust. Read Job or read Psalm 8, right? We are but dust and ashes. We are nothing but that. There's a little text that I just wrote about in my new book called, it's not little, it's actually big, lots of columns, from the Dead Sea Scrolls called the Thanksgiving Hymns, Hodayot, which can be Thanksgiving, but it can also be confessional hymns. And repeatedly, these songs iteratively will say, we are but dust and ashes. We come from nothing. We are just a fleshly spirit. But through blessing, through praise, through song, we can overcome that by recognizing God as the creator of the world and recognizing the world around us that's been created in a very beautiful way, reflecting on history and time, reflecting on aspiration towards becoming better, being godlike, not being God, but being godlike, and ultimately caring for the people around us. And I feel that's a very important message. Of course, it's all over Jewish liturgy as well to this very day. This is readings of recognizing cosmic dust and also recognizing what it is to take leadership. And along those lines, I think it's very important for what I said is, and I'm a teacher, right? I teach students all the time at all different levels. And I believe in our ability to to become better people. And I believe that we can overcome even the darkest hour through conversation with each other, through prayer, and through critical reflection on the world around us.
That's, yeah, no, that's a pretty helpful call. Shifting back to the ancient world, you lightly touched on it, but Philo's understanding of natural law. So he's in dialogue with people who believe in natural law, and he's trying to inject the law that his people observe is in relation to that. How did that go over? Do we know?
So that's a really good question. What you couldn't possibly know is that I just taught a term-long seminar on Philo of Alexandria with a great classicist, a Latinist named Tobias Reinhardt, and we spent quite a lot of time thinking about the law of nature. For those listeners that think that we're talking about natural law, especially now in Catholic doctrine about natural law and discourses of that sort, Jews also have written about it, David Novak or John Finnis. What we're really talking about when we're talking about Philo of Alexandria is thinking about nature as kind of creation or divine being in the world. And what Philo argues, if I can just give a little bit of background before I answer your question directly, what Philo argues is that the world is created, the cosmos is created with a kind of law of nature, which is isomorphic, which is equal to Mosaic law. There's natural law, there's Mosaic law. And through the creation of the world, God creates the possibility of living in accordance with the law just by being in the world, by discerning the order of the cosmos, the creation of the world, and human potential, which itself can express itself through hope, through elpis, and not fear, by living at one with nature. And Philo says that God did this incredible act of grace by giving the law to humanity, giving paradoxically the perfect expression of the law of nature in the world, which means you can get there without having your soul already at one with nature, like Abraham and Moses and Joseph already did. But you can get there through studying the law of Moses. It's a very interesting narrative. For him, what it is to be natural is to be at one, not to be God, but to be at one with divine intention in the world and to live in an ethical, logical, rational way and to reflect on the world. And one great way to do this, says Philo, if you get lost in the commercial, he'll say, or in administration, or in having to save your people, which is what he had to do after 38 in Alexandria. He had to go to Rome and he had to appeal for the protection for the Jewish people. He read scripture, he said, and scripture helped ground him and relocate him and remind him of this mystical, beautiful design of the world and of the cosmos through discerning God in the world. So that's what I mean by the law of nature. And I think it went down quite well. Clement and Origen and others picked it up and ran with it. To this day, law of nature has this huge impact in the history of Christian doctrine. There's other discussions about natural laws or specific Noahide laws, and this has been discussed extensively, and it has its own aftermath. It also has a difficult way. Natural law can be not descriptive, but very normative. And this has also been used as a stick, right? What is and is not natural. And that's really, I'm not saying that Philo couldn't have been used in that way. He could have been used in that way, but that's not the way in which I've studied the law of nature. The law of nature for me is a kind of a law of being. It's a way of being in the world that is consistent with divine implementation and strategy in the organization of a perfectly ordered cosmos. And you, as an individual, are given this opportunity, Jared, right, of living like that. If you give yourself the space and time to become the very best Jared. And he says, you should try to be Moses, but if you can't be Moses, be like Moses. That is, look at these figures. And this goes back to the issues around pseudepigraphy. I don't think it's about pseudepigraphy. I think it's about ideal figures that become pragmatic for how to behave. So we try to imitate them, but in writing about them and what they did and what they achieved, we're also writing about our own world. Sometimes we're even writing about our own aspirations for ourselves in the world.
Oh, okay. Man, you're really good at this. Because whenever it's my turn to speak, I have 4 things I want to ask you about, and I have to pick
Well,
one.
that's fantastic. So
Yeah.
go for it.
No, I can't do all of them at once. So I don't want to forget, because you did lightly touch on Jubilees. Jubilees in the temple document, but I am, I think, more curious probably. How much did Philo survive into contemporary Judaism?
So that's such a great question. So let me answer. This is a short answer. It did not at all, and yet it did. So in terms of the writings of Philo, the reason why we have Philo now is because the church fathers preserved Philo. Philo was copied and transmitted. David Runio's a great Philo scholar and a great philosopher. He shows this in like a transmission chart where he shows you who read him and where he was transmitted and in what languages: Armenian, Latin, Greek, of course. Now it exists in a Hebrew translation, which is spearheaded especially by my colleague and friend, Professor Maren Niehoff from the Hebrew University, which is very exciting. But Philo wasn't read. There are many debates about whether or not some of Philo's ideas and teachings found their way into the history of Jewish interpretation. There are people like Naomi Cohn and Samuel Belkin who said that the interpretations in the rabbis, you find these interpretations already in Philo. This is true, and my own teacher, my supervisor, and my hero, James Kugel, has written about this a lot. The problem is that his works as a whole were not transmitted. There are certain people along the way who rediscovered him. One is Azaria de Rossi, a very important moment where he wrote about Philo. He was a classicist as well as many other, he was trained, very learned in Judaism as well. And he wrote a book called Me'ore Naim, the opening of the eyes or the enlightenment of the eyes. And he knew Philo and he read Philo. The other thing that happened in the early, not only 20th century, but especially in the 20th century, as Jews were admitted into the academy, which is a relatively new innovation, no surprise to you, they were trained. They had training in rabbinic texts and close reading, and they often found their way into classics. And there were a number of Jewish classicists, not only Jewish classicists, but Jewish classicists who were really fascinated by Philo of Alexandria. So this is another way in which Philo started to be read, but in the university. Philo is still not. Also, Philo's hard to read in the original and even translations. It's complicated because it's rich interpretive essays and it's also rich philosophical work. So you really need both in order. This is why I just did this in Oxford for a term. It was so intense and so hard. But there was a big group of us, both people who work in Jewish interpretation and classicists, who were trying to understand Philo's Greek contribution to philosophical thinking and Philo's Jewish contribution. So it's really quite complicated. But the Greek speaking Jewish community ultimately did phase out, right? But Philo continued to be read and copied in Greek.
So the no would be no, he didn't directly because he wasn't circulated in Jewish circles.
Right. I mean, you'd find the
And
Mishnah and Midrash and the Talmudim on Jewish scholars' shelves. You wouldn't find volumes of Philo of Alexandria. There was more reading and application of Josephus than it was of Philo, which is also very interesting. But that's right. But at the same time, there's a lot in Philo that helps us understand ancient Jewish thinking, by which I mean Second Temple and rabbinic thinking. I've also argued that if you look very carefully at some of the Dead Sea Scrolls and discussion about wisdom and perfection, and you read that alongside Philo, there are lots of points of contact, which is fascinating. Because Philo knew Plato. Did the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls know Plato? We don't know, but they're certainly part of Hellenistic thinking. Did Philo know Hebrew? Meh. He knows some stuff. Recently, my colleague Alison Salverson suggested, which I think is very smart, that he had like word lists, but he makes mistakes. He gets things right, but he also gets things wrong. He also talks about inherited interpretations that he has from elders and from priests that get integrated into the synagogue when the lection for the day is read and then interpreted, he says, until 4 p.m. We also think that they might have been reading and thinking in Greek, not in Hebrew, which is also very interesting. So all of this is to say that Philo is very much an important piece of the history of Judaism, however, and Christianity. However, the simple answer would be no. The Jews across centuries weren't reading Philo. And yet, I mean, this goes back to an article I wrote a long time ago. There was a little book produced by a few colleagues of mine, Peter Oakes and Tikva Frimerkensky, who unfortunately is no longer alive, and David Novak. And it was a book called Christianity in Jewish Terms. And this was also in response, by the way, to Vatican II, thinking about what Jews can say. And I was asked to write on Philo. And what I said was, although Philo wasn't transmitted directly, every time philosophical discourse came into conversation with Judaism, very similar things happened. So whether you're talking about Philo or Saajagon or Maimonides or Rosenzweig or Levinas or Hermann Cohn, these things happened. And it's so interesting to watch points of contact.
okay, I don't. I'm going to keep going down a rabbit hole that will probably
Nice.
take us too far away from the book. So, Jubilees and 11Q Temple.
Jubilees.
Can we
And Temple Scroll. Should we talk about that?
please? Yes, go off.
Lots to say about those two wonderful works. Those of you that are listening that don't know the works, I'll just say a little bit about them. Jubilees is a work that we knew was transmitted also in later monastic communities, translated in a lot of different languages. We found it in no less than 15, possibly 17 copies amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls. which is amazing. Not full copies, partial copies. The book as a book is about as long as the book of Isaiah. So it's very long. It rewrites the beginning of Genesis into the middle of Exodus. It's known in Christian circles as sometimes the Little Genesis because it does all this beautiful rewriting. There are huge debates. Temple Scroll is a text that's found only in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's called 11Q Temple. It's found in Cave 11, especially, but there are other copies and texts that look a lot similar to it. Also, rewriting looks like the second half of Exodus or part of Exodus through the end of Deuteronomy. Obviously, there are certain breaks in the text, and we don't have all of the information. What I would say about these texts is what we see in these texts is radical, generous, interpretive, and complex rewriting of Genesis through Deuteronomy. The rewriting includes new prayers, new customs, new rituals, sometimes even new holidays. We also see updating and transformation of these texts. Jubilees is rewritten, and we're told that there's a higher and a lower law, or a first and a second law, or a heavenly and earthly law. So it's before Sinai, during Sinai, after Sinai is the time. The temple scroll is said to be rewritten by none other than God. So it's God who rewrites these texts and re-speaks to the community. They're extraordinary examples of what I'd like to call rearticulation of scriptural traditions in a way that we can come to understand the way these ancient interpretive communities from the 2nd century before the Common Era, a few hundred years before Jesus, were already writing and thinking about their texts, making them relevant, activating them, making them relevant for their community, for their present, for their future, but also summoning a past through what we might call pseudepigraphy, divine pseudepigraphy, or Mosaic pseudepigraphy. Jubilees is said to be written by Moses. But it's really, I don't think it's about replacing these texts, but it's about interpreting them in ways that are congenial to the way our ancient precursors thought about authenticating and authorizing text.
So
That's not to
that,
say that Jared wrote it, but that Moses wrote it.
yeah, I think there we get into a whole conversation, and that I'm learning even exists within the last year or two, that we may have the problem of thinking anachronistically about scribal activity and behavior in terms of what we think of in printing and reproduction. And that's what ancient scribes saw the responsibility as. And I know something like Jubilees, it may be clearer that the intention was to act as a commentary or a retelling necessarily, but in interacting with texts at all, it seems like scribes had a much broader mandate than what we may think of them as.
Did they?
I don't know. I
So
don't
let's
know.
talk a little bit about Google Docs. Let's talk a little bit about ChatGPT. Let's talk a little bit about the way we're thinking and rethinking originality and authorship and collective writing. Michel Foucault, in a little piece called What is an Author, talks about a group of mathematicians called Bourbaki, a whole group of them that are writing together collaboratively and creating a school. Or when we talk about a school of artists like Rembrandt, it's not just Rembrandt, but it's a whole community. I don't know if it's so different. I think we have a very linear way of thinking about what scribalism is and originality in writing. And I don't think the texts from antiquity or our own contemporary traditions are quite as fixed as we think they are. We certainly have a much stronger sense of who authored this and laws of plagiarism and those kinds of challenges, which are serious. If I have ideas, I don't want people to appropriate those ideas. My students' ideas I protect, and I help them protect them as they develop their own original thinking. But I also think there are ways in which we, as people living in 2024, really do understand what derivative work is and what a mashup is or a remix is in ways that are exciting and compelling for antiquity. We understand what's happening in antiquity. It's not plagiarism, it's creative remodeling or reshaping of traditions to make them contemporary again. The white album, the black album, the gray album. There's a lot to say about the world of music and the world of art. Or if we think about Monet's water lilies, which we know are a copy of, or at least influenced by, Olivia's gardens or the frescoes from antiquity, and we look at Twombly's roses, Cy Twombly's Roses, with roses surrounding you in a room and bleeding Rilke's poems down the side of them, or what Rothko did in his installation. So I'm saying that there's lots of repetition or derivative work, which also creates the space for originality. Or we could reformulate it in light of your earlier question about ancients being bound by or compelled by antiquity, and then repurposing that in a new way through articulation and creativity.
I'm reminded here of a conversation I had at SBO with a scholar named Bradley Marsh, and he was saying one of the things he runs into is that a lot of people engaging with biblical text in a translation are not used to marginal entries, little like marginal content. And so when I say, I think there may be a popular conception of what a scribe did. It was like you took this text and you copied it exactly in the same way that since Gutenberg, that's what we've done. And I know at least in American Bibles, the Bible tradition, it's been fewer and fewer marginal notes as time has gone on to where now I'm middle aged and unless it was called out as a study Bible, most of the people that I know, they don't have marginal notes in their Bibles and they think that's authentic. And I think some of these things like AI are, they're maybe challenging that idea, but what I'm experiencing is a lot of pushback, or people are not comfortable with the idea that ChatGPT is a legitimate way to produce something. And that may be a generational thing, but
No, sure. We don't have a choice. We have to embrace it, and we have to think forward, and we have to figure out how to negotiate our own creativity and our own voice. And this is not the first time that humanity has been given these kinds of challenges. But let's go back to your earlier point. And I know Bradley Marshall, he did his DPhil with Alison Salverson in Oxford, and I know him well, and he's a wonderful scholar, and he's absolutely right. I think part of what we need to do is help people understand that a printed Bible, like a King James Bible, comes out of a long, complex history of different versions and different languages, and our own misperception that texts are fixed without any kind of fluidity is just hopelessly anachronistic. On the one hand, we have a text, we have an identifiable text, but what surrounds the text, the marginal comments, the annotation, as well as the history of the transcription, is rich and variegated in ways that show signs of breathing in and breathing out. These are vital and animated entities.
as much as I like to talk, that is beautiful in a way that I can't really put words to. That is a lovely way to sum this up. So, is there anything from the book that you were hoping I would ask about that I have left out? And there's so much that I left out.
I think one thing I'd like to share with the listeners of this podcast is that without understanding fully what I was doing it, in that book, the book from 2003, I was really calling for an ethical way of receiving the history of Judaism in Protestant Bible theology, which really left no room. I still think it's a challenge for Judaism to breathe independently or on its own as a living organism. And this is something that you raised earlier. And my new book called Scriptural Vitality, Rethinking Philology and Hermeneutics takes it one step further and challenges the claim that in the Hellenistic period, the end of Daniel, like the end of the biblical period, that we call this late Judaism, or that Hebrew became an artificial language. Quite to the contrary. Hebrew continued in vernacular and non-vernacular context, to quote Jeffrey Kahn, who's my colleague and the Regis Professor of Hebrew at Cambridge University. And I would like people to take away that this living and breathing across different linguistic registers, and even within Hebrew itself, continues to grow and change. And transformation doesn't mean losing authenticity or original moments. It means creating new original moments.
Wow, that's even better than the last one. So there are a ton of names that you have brought up already. You've done a pretty good job of citing your sources as you've been talking, which kudos for that. But are there books, blogs, content creators, podcasts, whatever, that you would send people to get a better understanding of what you're trying to do in this book or your approach to
Yes.
biblical
Let
and
me
textual studies in general.
Yes, that's great. Let me give you a couple of names and some and their work. It's really a body of work. Of course, my own teacher, James Kugel, in order to understand the creative and watershed actually of interpretation and growth and transformation, I would read everything he wrote, but especially the Bible as it was, or the longer version, the traditions of the Bible. I think to understand how Hebrew is a dynamic and transforming language, vernacular and non-vernacular, from its earliest all the way through the medieval times and beyond. I would read Jeffrey Kahn. He's wonderful. I think some extraordinarily accessible and brilliant work on historical hermeneutics, but also very current work on this field. I would read Conrad Schmid, and a lot of his work has been translated into English, SCHMID, from Zurich University. Judith Newman has written some of the most important work on prayer and scripture. Her first book called Praying by the Book, and then she's had many articles and books subsequent to that, but she's developed a concept of scripturalized prayer, understanding how scripture and prayer come together in the context of new compositions. My own predecessor at Oxford, John Barton, has done some really beautiful work on wisdom and ethics in the field of biblical studies. I think my list can go on. I have really people who are so precise and so careful about the Dead Sea Scrolls, both philologically and in terms of the manuscript tradition. And here I would mention Ibert Tichelar, people who are thinking about priesthood and the combination between priesthood and sacrifice and prayer. A colleague of mine, Arjen Bach, who's now starting at Cambridge. I also have a colleague named Lauren Stuckenbrook in Munich, who has really carried forward some of the questions that you've raised with New Testament in such a beautiful and brilliant way, thinking about non-redemptive reading as a way of thinking about Paul as a scholar, as a Christian, and a scholar of New Testament. And he also works across scrolls. I mean, my list can go on, and I'm sorry if I've on the Temple Scroll, I would read Molly Zahn and Lauren Schiffman. On Jubilees, I would read James Vanderkam, of course, and there are many others. What's exciting is I'm mentioning senior scholars, but there are many younger scholars whom we could also mention. And to name a few other senior scholars, I think to mention some of the most important names in textual criticism, Emmanuel Tove, on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and thinking about them as poetic, beautiful poetic compositions, I would, of course, talk to Noam Mizrahi from the Hebrew University. So I think I've thrown out a few names and a few figures, and it's a small percentage of the people that I think with and work with every day.
That's a fantastic list. And you could keep going on all day if you wanted to. I'm here to hear what you have to say. And of course, read Seconding Sinai. Of course.
Thank
What do you read for fun?
Oh, that's such a good question. I used to read a lot of literature. I don't have a lot of time right now. I think a book that I'm reading I don't know if it's fun, but my daughter just recommended to me Crying in H Mart because my mother just passed away. So I think it's a beautiful book, Michelle's Honor. But I think when I read poetry now, whether it's Celan or Holderlin or books that help me think about how to be a better teacher, but also how to think about the challenges of life now, I think is what I look for. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure I'm answering the fun answer. I think I
No,
read
if it's
right
whatever
now.
you think is
Yeah,
fun.
yeah. I think right now my reading outside of my own scholarship is about helping me integrate the challenges that come my way and also thinking hard about how to be a better teacher and a better writer. So I've read a lot of Peter Sandi, who's a German theoretical hermeneutical philosopher of a sort. Stanley Cavell is a very important figure for me, whom I mentioned earlier. I love the work of Arnold Davidson. He's now at the Hebrew University. He was at Chicago for many years. I mention these people because these people are helping me think about things outside of my own small world of biblical studies and take me to new places I haven't gone yet. This is what I'm doing now. Um,
So I want to hear more about what do you, not necessarily authors or books specifically, but like when you step away from something you've just read and you say, this makes me a better teacher, can you put a little more meat on those bones? What does that mean?
if I'm able to understand more deeply, having read poetry, what it is to talk about poetic lines in ancient Judaism, that's what I mean. So Celan and Rilke. help me better understand ancient poetry because it gives me a broader context, or reading about fan fiction or alternative universes. It's not because I think it's exactly the same, but that's also helped me understand pseudepigraphy. Not because it's the same, but I try to go outside of my own field in order to understand more deeply and more extensively what notions of attribution are, for example, or how traditions around Star Trek grow, in order to understand how traditions around Moses grow. Not because it's the same, but because just like I think we have a lot to learn from antiquity, I think that antiquity has a lot to learn from us.
And I only wanted to emphasize that part of the conversation because I sat in a room and watched your former and current student demonstrate to me what a mentor, what a wonderful mentor you had been and still are for them. And so on the human side of it, I saw that. And look, just so you know up front, I'm going to gush about what I saw in that room in the introduction. But right here, I figured I could see and I could hear it in this interview what a talented and skilled and thoughtful teacher that you are, and how you have mentored. I don't know, there were a couple dozen people in that room and they all admired you. And like I said, you were the first scholar recommended on this podcast, and you have been recommended to me by other people who've been on this podcast. So I didn't want that to go unrecognized, that if she says something makes her a better teacher, other teachers should.
If I could respond before we bring things to a close, if I could just say two more things, is that okay? So, one is that if I'm a good teacher, it's because I'm in conversation with my students. I learn as much from my students and my own children as I teach them. So I feel that it's a reciprocal relationship all along. And the second thing is a bit of an emotional thing. You asked me, what am I reading? So I'm reading to try to figure out how to fill this black hole inside of me because my mother just passed away. And I dedicated the book to her called Vitality of Scripture, Scriptural Vitality as the title. But she was a teacher's teacher, and she was the most incredible presence on this earth. And she gave to everyone in every way in her years of teaching, of mentoring, of redefining the way we think about how to teach people how to read, integrating Dewey into the way in which she thought about a kind of philosophy of education. And she would be so proud. I've heard you say that, but I would say that I'm not worthy and I don't hold a candle to who she was as a teacher. But it touched me very deeply that you said that about my students and about my role as a mentor to them. And people often say, what's your favorite part about your job? And I always say, it's about mentoring a new generation of scholars. And I always say to my students, you don't do what I do, you do what you do, and you find a new pathway. I want my students to learn from me, but I also want them to learn how to critically evaluate what I've achieved so they can also create their own pathway. And that's the community that I hope I've created in Oxford at the Center for the Study of the Bible.
I don't think we could end it any better than that. Hindy Najman, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Jared.
Thank you so much for listening. I appreciate the support of just the downloads and you listening. Again, any feedback that you have, please send it to it means what it means at gmail.com. And if you're looking for material ways to support the podcast, $5 a month, you can hear episodes a week before they come out for free. A good example of that is the preview of my conversation with Rabbi Reuven Chaim Klein that you're about to hear. You could go hear that episode now if you're listening on the day that this dropped for free for $5 a month. So without any more delay, here's a preview of that conversation with Rabbi Klein. Thanks again.
Now, in Orthodox Judaism, there's a concept of Shnayim Mikra ve'echad Targum. It's twice the scripture and once the Targum. This is an idea, and we could talk about this a little bit later. This is an idea that a person sort of has to be in step with the rest of the Jewish community, the worldwide Jewish community, which is reading different parts of the Pentateuch every week. And there's an expectation that every male Jew is supposed to read that week's portion twice in the original Hebrew and once in the Aramaic Targum. So, in my high school, we took this very seriously, and every Sunday morning we actually used to have a test on the on the Torah portion that we had read, the previous day in the synagogue, which we had been studying the whole the week before. In our high school, we actually had official study sessions on Saturday afternoon or Saturday night, and in some grades we also had some study sessions, in official school time. So that was sort of that was the high school experience in studying the Bible.